So what I want to do today is continue with where we left off. And I want to do a little demo. So last time we were at the place where, so we talked about controllers, remember that? And we talked about how to test controllers and how controllers are mostly boilerplate types of entities that just pass stuff through. The less customized they are, the better the application. The less trouble we have to deal with. And we went through a couple of examples, starting with the read test pattern. So how do we read stuff? There's a couple of ways to read things from the application, namely list all entities, typically the index view or index method, then get a form that displays the new view, which is used to display a form for a new record. But it's not the creation of the new record, it's just the display of what to fill in. Same for edit, and typically these are always, the way to test for them is always the same. We make the request in the controller using a get and then the action name. Then we check that certain variables are assigned if we need them. And we check that the correct template and the redirect is in place if we want that. Some of that code that comes from the RSpec generator is kind of stock and tests the defaults. And I also mentioned that this is not always necessary to retest and clutters up the test code. Here's our read methods, and they don't do much. So as I mentioned earlier, we sometimes assign a variable, and then in our test, we verify that that variable is assigned in the people controller spec. Where are they here? The index one up here. And from last time, we already deleted those ones that were repetitive and redundant. Is this clear so far? Can I resume from here? Yes? Good? Okay. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make a create method so that we can actually write some stuff. So we had a new method already, and we had a test for it. Here's the new one, get new. This is your get verb, and it's the new template. And I said, this stock stuff is not that interesting because that is just defaults. Now, the interesting bit was what happens when we actually need to do something. We assign a new person object that is freshly created. Why that's important, we'll see in a second. And we ran that test, and the controller has new person. So far, so good. Let me run the application. Okay, so here's my browser. We want to look at that localhost 3000, this one. And in here, our URL is mapped to people. Yes? Okay, something is slow today. People new. And that's how far we got. So we need to actually make some form fields on here so that we can display the form to create a new person. So that's where TDD for me ends for now. We'll get back to it in a second, but I'm going to throw in a view that has form fields. So here's our view file. And in here, we need to do something that is creating a new form. You guys familiar with that? What to do here? Yeah? What am I typing? Somebody. Form 4. Right. And then what? How about person? Person. Do F. That's our builder. And then in here, now I need to end this. Don't put an equal sign here. This will mess you up. Rails 3 fixes this, but Rails 2 doesn't have that fixed yet. And then now in here, I can now, I can now access the fields that belong to this person object, such as, for example, I can make a label for the first name, and I can make a text field for the first name. Reload. Whoa, undefined method people path. So what I did here is I didn't write a test for this. I had to actually go to the browser to test it. Generally, that's a no-no. Don't ever do that, except when you're dealing with some nitty-bitty view things that are really easy to test. The view layer is the easiest to test from the application, from the user interface, and you get the least bang for line of test code for your dollar, for your time on that. But there's a few exceptions. This one. So we're missing something here. Anybody know what we're missing? A route, yes. I did mention perhaps last time that there is something about routes that comes back to your point perhaps, that RESTful resources in Rails have these kinds of routes. So generally you want a people path and a people URL. And to get those, we have to declare a map.resources people. The form 4 is the one that is requesting this. This people URL or the people path. Do you guys know what the difference is between path and URL? Right, so the difference is, yeah, it's a relative versus an absolute path. The URL gives you the protocol, the HTTP, and then the domain name. And the underscore path method gives you only the path components without the domain name and the protocol. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's looking for a people path. And the interesting bit is that the pluralization rules are baked in. So I can go here now and I can put in a resource. In fact, there is some examples in here in the comments already for you. Documents it. So I could stick in a person, a people path here, but this is one of these things I want to test. I don't want to take this for granted. So on routes, I like testing. So let's make a route test. In the specs here, there is a file. There is no file so far. Let's make a directory called routes and throw in a file called people routes spec.rb. If you make a scaffold with rspec, then this will already be there. And we require spec helper. And then I say describe. Now typically this will describe the people controller also, because the people controller is the one that ends up receiving the actions that come from the routes. This one doesn't have to be in quotes. No, this is just like the model tests where you can put the class name here, and you actually get, in the model tests, you get this nice subject feature we discussed last time if you do that. And somebody's off my Dropbox here. Let's kill that for a sec. Let's kill some stuff up here. Okay. So it should route. What we want is we want the new form, so which is under people/new. So that is something it should do. And there's a very nice feature that rspec helps us with. So you can say get. This is the request verb. People new should route to. That's the rspec helper. And then in here, you put in the stuff that it should resolve to: controller, people, and and action new. This should route to. One sec. This should route to goes both ways. So if you the routing module, as you might know, is bidirectional. It deals with both the parsing of incoming URLs, and it figures out from those what controller and action should go to. But it also generates URLs in the application. Given a controller and an action, it can figure out what URL to generate for a link that you want to put on the page. Or even for RESTful routes, even given just an object, like a person object, it figures out what route to make for that. And that's very powerful. This is what the Form 4 feature uses. And we'll see that in a sec. Let's see how that works, if it works. Something is totally broken now. Oh, there we go. Okay. So why does this actually work? Should that have worked? I didn't put anything in routes. Default, yes. These guys down here, right? These catch it. So anytime you have a controller/action, by accident you get it right. Lucky. Okay, let's put some more in here. So new is one that works by accident. How about the index one? It should route just /people, right? That should become the index routing, route. This one is probably going to work by accident also. Yeah. Okay, cool. What about create? So now we have new, which displays the form. That's actually a GET request. It's a read request. Create posts back the contents of that form to the server. That's a post request. And in RESTful lingo, we use the same route for that, but with a post verb. So the verb, get versus post, distinguishes what action it should go to, even though the URL is the same. That's RESTful. So now we need a post verb here, post to /people, and that should route to. And now I want the controller to be, I want the action to be create. Now with this one, I'm out of luck here. It says the recognized options action did not match the create. So it recognized people and index action, but that's not what I wanted. And the reason is because the default dummy routes cannot distinguish the verbs. So now's the time has come where we have to put into the routes file the actual resource-based thing. So somewhere in here we put map.resources people. And now that gives me a host of routes. Is this familiar to people, or who has never seen this before? Brand new? Hot off the press? Okay. Another little nifty trick is, which might be useful, oops, I totally did not get that right. Which might be useful for some, is to be able to use rake routes. That gives me a dump of all the routes in the system, which are all these people routes here. So there's a people method. This is only the first bit of the method. This one can be followed by underbar path, underbar URL, and that, this is the post request, goes to create action. So far so good, right? Okay, so now we have a route. Now hopefully our web browser will now work. Looks better now, right? So now I can put in something, but there's no button here, which is a bummer. So it's actually nothing to be done here. So let's go find a button. Okay, so now we need a button on here. Just throw that button in.
Certainly a way to figure out if you have routes that you haven't been testing or something. Just take them off and see what system.
Yeah, probably a good idea. So f.submit. And then we have a button. The save changes is the default. If you don't put anything after this here, you can put a verb here or some word. Then it'll take that. Okay, if I click this, no action responded to create. That's good news. That means the URL was correct. We went to the right place. This is probably a place where I should talk a little bit about the form for. Form for is a cool thing. So we use the form for with the add person. Now this add person can be a new record, as in our case was the case. Then the form for will generate a route that uses the form for will generate a URL that goes to the creation route. It'll use the post verb and it'll go to action people. If that new person is an existing record in the database, has an ID to it, in other words, this case down here applies, then form for is smart enough to actually generate a put method on there, which then gets funneled to the update route through the RESTful routing. So you end up with the same form. You can go to two different actions depending on whether or not the record is new or existing. It's a very powerful method, and I encourage you to get to the bottom of it, because I see so much code that tries to circumvent all this power and ends up in the weeds somewhere. So this is really helpful. Okay, so we need to actually make our controller accept some stuff, accept data. So let's do that here. The create, update, test pattern. So the create action and the update action are very similar, and this is the pattern with which we want to test them. So first we're going to make a request that includes all the form fields which we want to submit. In our case, the first name, the last name, This is an update request. It should also include the ID of the record that we're trying to update. Then the next thing we need to check is the variable assignments. Typically, for the new record creation, we'll end up with a person variable somewhere in the controller that should have been saved if it's successful. We check for success. There could be two cases, right? There could be a failure if the model doesn't validate properly. Then you have one branch, and if it does validate, you have another branch. So if it's successful, typically what happens is you redirect somewhere. You save and redirect to the list or to the show. If it's failure, then typically you re-render the same form and you display error messages. And lastly, we want to verify that this is only accessible with the right HTTP verb. This is very important, the last bit, because you don't want to open your controller, create or update or destroy actions to a GET request. Why is that important? Search robots, Google robots, yes. They will canvas the entire site on any accessible URL and they will ping it with GET requests. And if your database modifying actions are open to GET requests, the Google robot will shamelessly write to your database. So don't do that. Be careful to A, test for it, and B, put it in. So let's do it. Okay, next step. Here's the formula. As I said at the last class, controllers are very formulaic. We always want to follow the formula. The controller should not be modified, really customized. If you find yourself going down the route of customizing the controller with lots of if-else statements, then most likely you're writing code that belongs in the model. Create and update controller should have two branches, success, failure, that's it. Okay, so first of all, we need to find the record from parameters. If it's an update, that means it's an existing record, we need to load that record. Or for create, we just instantiate a new model with the parameters submitted. Then we want to assign the form field parameters to that object. Rails is super helpful at this. It should be a single assignment, regardless of how complicated the form and how complicated the models. It should be a single assignment, one assignment. If you're not using a single assignment, you're not refactoring properly. Single line. This is the controller formula. The controller is stupid. It does not do anything. It doesn't know about the intricacy of the data that is passing through. It's a pass-through. Then you save it, and then you handle the failure case, or the success case, or the failure case. Right? Okay. Without further ado, let's do one. And let's start with our people controller spec and controller file. And so we have currently covered in here, can you guys read that in the back? The new index up here, new down here, and edit a little bit, not much. Edit we haven't really covered. So I'm going to throw in here the next case. Describe post create. Whoops. Create. It should. Now what does it need to do? What are we trying to verify? What's our formula and what's our test pattern?
Success and failure.
We should test for success and failure. It should. Excellent. Actually, it shouldn't. So it should have a context. Thanks, Kai. When successful, do something, and when failure, do something else. So there's two cases, and it's nice to test them in these two different branches. If you cannot read that, I will just stick this one on the bottom. So this moves up a little bit. There you go. Right, and then there's sometimes there's some common stuff that happens in all cases. Like the variable assignment, right? It should assign a person variable, perhaps, variable. So there's that. So when successful, it redirects to index, right? You save something and you go back to the index page. That's one way. You could also go to show page or some other place. It should, let's not say that. It creates a person record. And these are two good ones. And for the failure case, we want to have something like it, this is mistyped, it redirects. So it shouldn't redirect on the failure case. If you redirect, that means we go to the browser and we tell the browser, make another request somewhere else. If we do that, we lose all the state that we had. So we don't want to do that. We want to re-render the same form.
With the errors.
With the errors, yeah. And actually, Rails helps us there because the object, if it fails saving, the person object is going to contain the errors, right? Through the validation call. You call save on something. We tested that in the first couple classes. The save will call valid, and the valid generates that error array. Those errors are available, and there's a view helper. Actually, no flash. No, it's all automatic. There's a view helper that just injects them. We'll see that in a second. Okay, so re-renders which page? Nope, there's no create page. The new page. There's two requests, right? One request that gets the new template. That's just the template. Create it doesn't actually have a view to it. Generally redirects on success, or it re-renders the new on failure, because then you get the same form with all the variables pre-filled, all the fields pre-filled. And in this case, it should not create. It does not create a person record. That's something else that's valuable to check. So that looks pretty good. And then I said also we want to test the failing verb, right, to make sure that the verb is only a post. Let me just throw that in here. So context. When using a verb other than post, something should happen. It rejects the request somehow. We'll see how we can test that. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so how are we going to fill this out? One thing I like to do is I like to start with a couple post parameters. Let me just be a little more explicit here. So post create, that's the method, right? I just showed you on the slide. We need to actually make the request. This is the request. And then we have a comma here, and we stick in some parameters now. So these parameters are going to be largely similar for most of these cases. So I'm going to just make some before block here with a list of post parameters. And the post parameters are the same that come from the form. Now, if we're not sure what the form looks like, we can take a look in here with Firebug. You guys have seen this already, right? Firebug, it's a great tool. People/new. And now let's take a look as to what these forms look like. You see in here, fortunately this doesn't go any bigger. This is the input field. It has a person, square brackets, first name. This ends up parsing on the Rails side as a hash, with person is the key, and the first name is another key inside this is a nested hash. And then the first name points to the value. This is how it ends up from HTTP parsing into Rails. Rails is the one that ends up taking the square brackets off and figures out it should do a nested hash out of it. HTTP just passes it right through. So it ends up being a person that points to a hash. Person's the key, and now that hash has keys, subkeys, which are the things in the square brackets. And now that points to the thing that you put into that the user puts into the input field. The reason I pointed this out is if you're not sure how to write these tests, you have two ways to do it. One is you can use Firebug to inspect it, or the other one, actually, perhaps the best method, thanks for reminding me of that, is the request parameter. If we get that here. Come on. Yes, please. I created here. I called people controller create, right? This is after I hit submit. And it tells me here, this is the stuff that got submitted. It's always good for the create tests, you can use the logs to make your tests from. That way you get the right parameters in the right order. Okay, so first name and the last name, right? Okay, Smith. Okay, so this is my post parameters. Now I can use these everywhere here. So this is what gets posted. Now, I should assign a variable, right? So I want to verify something. Assigns person dot should not be nil. And I can also verify, slightly redundant. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Should be kind of person, so it's actually a person object. And if you want to be really specific, you could verify that that these first and last name parameters also match. I typically don't bother with that level of detail because the controller doesn't actually pull out that level of detail. The code shouldn't deal with first and last names. The controller code shouldn't even know that they're the first and last name. So you don't have to double check that. Okay, so let's see here. We have redirects to index. So right, I want to make another post create. In fact, I'm going to do lots of post create, so I should probably pull that out here and stick that into another before. Post create, post params. And so then this is repeated for all the it cases, and now all I have to do is check the assertion. And RSpec helps us again here. There is the response object, and RSpec augments that response object with some cool stuff. Should redirect to. Nope, that doesn't look right. What is it? Should be redirect? Somebody help. You guys know this stuff. Is it? That's it, right? Okay. And we want to redirect to the people path, which is now the method that comes from the routes, right? And it creates the person record. So I'm going fast now. If we did this in a slower way, you could do one test, run the test. Actually, let's do it. Okay, so no action responded to create. Okay, good enough. Let's make one. There's no create action. Def create. So far, so good. Let's rerun the test suite. Okay, that looks better now. So here is a failure. 57. It says should not be nil. If I didn't have this line there, it would blow up at me with a red exception now. Okay, so there's no person assigned here. Okay, that's maybe a point. We should have a person in there. Let's throw in the person. At person equals person.new. So that makes a new person, right? Now I want to put the fields that came from the form. This is a form post, right? It has all these fields. We saw that in the log. In there. How do I do that? You guys know the param. Right. So there's the params hash, which contains all the parameters that come from the web request, including other stuff like the controller name, the action name, and some other stuff. So what I want out of this params hash is just the bits that belong to the person, which came from the person form. Because we use the form for person, the form for is smart enough to prefix all the fields with that person key, and we get these two nested hashes, or this one nested hash, 2 levels deep. And that is the assignment. That's all I need. We need to save it later, but for now, that should be good enough. Okay, so we have a redirect problem, right? It expected a redirect to people, but got no redirect. This error here. Great. Okay, so I go back in, and I fix that here, and I'm just going to throw in a redirect to people path shebang. All tests pass. Not yet. The test doesn't specify that yet. Nothing has failed yet, right? Okay, question. Right, so Jim's question is, the server reports that the browser submitted this authenticity token, and I'm not sticking that into my test parameters, so why is the test passing? Good question. Do you guys know what this is for in the first place? It's so that people can't hijack the session and can just inject something random from some command line tool. Yeah, this authenticity token feature is great, and it's disabled for testing by default. So there is a global setting, protect forgery, which you can turn on or off in the application controller. By default, it's on, except for test mode or test environment. It's off. Yes. If that were on, then you have to put that there. So we need to actually verify that the record got created. Somebody told me we need to call save, right? But let's first test for that. So lambda. So what I want to test is that something should change. Namely, I want to make sure that the person count changed by 1. If I put the correct post in here, and actually now I can't do the before filter thing anymore, never mind. So take that back out. This doesn't work here because this needs to go in between the lambda block, because the lambda block, the should change clause, runs the count before and after the block and compares the difference. So then I need to put that here as well.
Another one in,
Get rid of that again. Or I could factor the context differently if I wanted to, but it's fine. So that needs to be there. Let's check that out. Okay, so it should have changed by 1, but was changed by 0 is the error message, which is the correct expected failure. And that's because I didn't save anything. So let's go save that person. Save. And now it's dandy. Don't stop here. Error handling is the most important and most underappreciated part of an application. So let's do the error handling. So when it fails, so let's make a post that's invalid. So I can probably rig the post parameters in the before. So I had some post parameters, but now I'm going to delete the first person, the first name. Or rather, I will actually set person first name to blank, because this is what would come from a browser. If the browser submitted an unfilled field, it would just show up as a blank string. So we want to make sure that still causes a failure. We know this causes a failure because we tested our models at length ad nauseum a couple of weeks ago. And this is why it's so important to test the models, because then you don't have any trouble here. The error handling just deals with the controller bit, the user response to it. You don't have to worry about the, what and how and under what circumstances the models fail or don't fail. If you find yourself missing a case, which is common, you code along, you do the controller, oops, there's some condition I didn't catch, then put a pending here and resume the model testing. Go there first, and then once you're done there, come back here. Pending, by the way, is one of these guys. I don't know if you've seen it before. That will give you a nice output here saying that there is something unfinished down here. It has now a pending to do something, and this shows up in the command line also. So this is cool to do, and this happens quite often. Sometimes you're in the middle of something and you need to realize you need to go somewhere else first. Okay, so we're going to create this now with the invalid post params. And so I want to make sure that it should render template. So this is the other one, right? Up here we're using should redirect to. Now down here I want to actually not redirect, I want to render a template, which is the new template. I want to go back there. And I also want to verify that it didn't create a record here. It's probably the most important thing. See, something is not right. There we go. So, and then it should not change the count. So let's see how these tests behave. I'm sorry?
You're expecting failures.
I'm expecting failures, yeah. So here's the render one. This one actually got a redirect, because we had an unconditional redirect in our code. So not surprisingly that fails, and this is the correct place where it fails. And it didn't create the person. That already passed. Why does this pass? Because the validations catch it already, right? Yeah. This is a double check of the validation rule. Okay, so I like to put this in anyway because of the symmetry of it. I check that it does work and I check it doesn't work. So now we need to actually make a branch here. I talked about a branch earlier. If, save, good, do this. Else, bad, render, new. That's it. Controller has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, if you don't count the method declaration. That's it. Controller shouldn't be more complicated than that. It's just that. Good question. So what happens if could I do a redirect new here, a redirect to : new, and what would be different? Yes, I can do that, and then it tells the browser to make a new request, which goes to the new action up here, and it makes a new person. That would work, but there's one caveat. What's the caveat? The fields are not pre-filled, yes. And the error messages are gone. Okay, let's put the errors in the view, yes. It's in the new template, this guy. So there is something really clever here, provided by Rails. You can just say f.error messages. That's all. So f is the form builder. So this thing is smart enough to figure out that this form is attached to a person, which is an object, which might have errors, and if it has errors, it puts them there. And if it has errors, it also puts another div around every single field that has errors. And then you can style that div with red, so that the box shows up in red. You get all this for free if you use the form 4. If you don't use the form 4, you have to do all this manually. It's going to take you weeks and weeks and weeks, and you never get it right anyway. So don't do it. Like before you give up, try it. Really try it. Because the power in these methods, these highest level methods, is incredible. And myself as a coder, I could only do a poor job to reinvent the wheel because I'm not expert at inventing wheels. The Rails guys and the open source community behind this are experts at doing these things, and they've done it for many years, and they have been refining it over time. I find it rather pretentious for me to go in there and say, this doesn't work, and I do my own thing. And oftentimes when I have that attitude, I end up in the weeds.
Maintenance nightmare too.
It becomes a maintenance nightmare. So I got errors now, and also if I go in with Firebug, I can see now that this field, oops, this weren't so tiny. I would see that this field is now surrounded by a field with errors div, which I can style, and then you can do something. So it's all free, right? Okay, so we have a test now that covers our creation action. Oh, there's one missing. And we have a view that actually lets us submit a form, wherever it was, this one. And that actually gives us error messages that are correct. So if I fill in the name, then I actually do get now a successful creation. This is where we could do a little flash if you wanted. Do you guys know about flash? You can throw in a little flash bit here. So if the save is successful, we could say, okay, flash notice. You can test for this, you don't have to. I find this kind of stuff, is this chain is too brittle. The tests become too brittle, and it's not mission critical. Like the application doesn't break, or the behavior doesn't break if you don't have that message showing up. It's a little bit of a usability, perhaps. Now, to actually make this show up, we need to also throw this into our layout, which we don't have, or we could toss it in here. One minus here? All right. And there should probably be a link on here too to go back to make a new person. And it should actually list the people on there. So oh, it didn't actually show it because it's on the wrong place. Okay, let's fix the index view first. Index. So this index view should probably list the people. So we can put in the flash notice and we can say something like the people are, we had the people variable in the controller. If you follow the conventions and you name the stuff the same, you have a people variable for more than one, you have a person variable for just one, you don't have to think too hard about what you should be using where. Only if you deviate from the conventions, you are in trouble. And so we can do like a list or something. I like Haml also. Who knows about Haml? A couple people? Yeah. So Haml is another way to do markup in Rails, and you don't have to ever close anything because auto-closing. It works with indents. And it looks more, yeah, it's less cluttered. It's cleaner look. So it's great, actually.
I've had problems with blank error pages.
In Haml?
In Haml, yeah.
Try again.
Huh?
Try again. I think we actually had a full name method on that, if I recall correctly. We'll see. And I should probably run that through HTML escape. So let's see. And then flash notice. Okay, so, okay, I guess there's no full name method per person. I think the other app has it. It's okay. First name. Last name. Okay, there's all the people. Let's toss in a link for link 2. How would this work? People.
Back.
It's the show. Oh, you want to show.
I'm sorry?
You want to show him.
I want to go to make a new person.
Oh, no.
So I could say something like this.
Create.
New person, and I give it the path that goes with, which is it? I forget.
People.
Let's take a look at the rake output here. People new person path, that one. I think there might also be a shortcut for this. Okay, try that again. There's a new person. And now we got a flash message as well. Cool. All right, so far so good. Okay, so far we have tested this. I want to go back to a little bit of checking here. How much is enough? Actually, I want to first of all let's recap a little bit. We had our controller pattern, this one, right? So the pattern for the test is very similar for each case. We make the request with the form field. So the post create bit with the form fields that we had in our post parameters. Then we check all this stuff. And this tends to break into multiple cases. So we check that the person variable gets assigned. We check the success case. In the success case, we see that the variable is saved and the new record is created. And we want to redirect somewhere. In the failure case, we want to see that the variable is not get saved and there's no record created. And we re-render typically the same template in the general case. And lastly, we want to check the HTTP verb, which we haven't done yet. So let's finish there. I have already put the test in, but we haven't fleshed it out yet. So this is the situation when I make a GET request, for example, to the create action. It shouldn't let me do it. And what instead should happen? I can redirect to new. Yeah, that's one way. You could do a 400 error. Yeah, I think by default it ends up being a 400 error. So the 400 level error codes tend to indicate some handled error in the application. It should raise would indicate that an exception gets raised and is not handled by the application, and that is thrown. Yeah, that's a good idea. So all these are valid. There isn't really a specific pattern for this that we do, but I like to check at least that something. So the GET request is one request that I want to check against. And let's see what I had here. The simplest way that I found to do it is we can actually use one of our stubs from last session that we discussed. So the controller, it shouldn't receive the create call. It should be intercepted somewhere before it even gets to create. So one way to do is you can want to set up one of these method expectations and say should not receive, should not receive create. All of the other stuff that was mentioned is valid. You could check that it has a 400 some error code, or it raises some exception somewhere. You could do all of that. And this is one of these places where a stub actually is sort of the shortest test. And the reason we can do it is that we know it doesn't get to the create method, and how else the error is handled is not so important. It probably is important for the overall application behavior, so if we want to flesh it out in more detail, we could say, okay, this returns a 400 or a 40 something error, or it renders a certain template in response. This is the error message it just generated. It said a mock expectation error, and it expected create 0 times, but it received it once. So the message was sent once. In other words, the action did get to that controller method call, or this request did get to the controller action. And this is what we wanted to inhibit. So I want to check what happens if I make a GET request against the create action. Like the Google robot would make a GET request. And currently, the GET request is not inhibited. Meaning, the Google robot could do a form post. Okay. All right, how are we going to do this? Ideas? Yeah, before filter. Before filter is good. What is the before filter? Right, so it runs the before filter. So I can put here a couple of things. I can put here a method definition, a method name. I can say check something here. Check verb. That's one way. And I could check the request. You know, does the request verb equal post, then do something. I can put a proc here also. .new, which gets the request right here. And you can do some other stuff. And if this returns false or redirects, then it aborts the action. There is an already Rails way built in, yes. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Has anybody heard of verify? Verify is an automatic before filter that has some sort of pre-baked things that people want to check commonly, including method post, for example. So if you look at the API documentation, which undoubtedly you're doing right now, let's look it up. Search for verify. Not that one. That one. Hit return. Here. This is all the stuff you can verify. Let's make this a little bigger, bigger. Verify the given action so that certain prerequisites are not met. The user is redirected to a different action. And you can check for a number of different things, including the method. That's what I'm using, which is the verb, HTTP verb. Or I can check for, this is important for AJAX, I can check for the request type. Is it an XHR request? Is it this stands for XML HTTP request, also known as an AJAX request. You can check for other stuff. You know, you can check for stuff in the parameters array, for headers, all sorts of stuff. This is good. It takes some modifiers. In this case, the modifier I want to use is I want to only check this for the create method. All the other actions should be accessible for GET requests, but the create one should not be. And what this actually will do, this will actually generate by default, it will generate a 400 error. You could also give it another argument here to redirect somewhere or to return a specific status code. There's some options and you can read about in the docs. Okay, so testing, right? We haven't actually tested anything in the view yet. Let's get there. How much is enough? So far no view testing. What I like to always test is I like to test the behavior over the display, specifically error messages. You get a lot more mileage out of testing errors than testing views, or testing for errors. And the view doesn't have if-else in it, right? No if-else in views, right? So no need to test for branching. So the branching should all be either in the controller, if success, do something, if failure, do something else. Should be in the model if you have complicated business logic. Or sometimes you might have a helper. If you do permissions-based stuff, you know, if certain users, like an administrator, is supposed to see a partial that the other user is not supposed to see, that could come from a helper. Or that could be, if it's just a one-liner, you know, render partial if admin question mark. That could also be in the view. And then you should have view testing. And I'm going to show one in a sec. Actually, I'm going to give you a quick primer on this, but we'll get back to it in a sec. What's driving the development? So my approach to this is I'm not doing the outside-in BDD type thing. My approach to it is, okay, think about one vertical slice through the application. If you're doing BDD, you tend to concern yourself a lot with views, display, and perhaps controller type things like interactions with the application. Generally, that is time spent not so well. in my point. Again, same as the chart that I showed in the first week, that you get a lot of bang for the buck for testing code on the models. You get a lot of bang for the buck on implementation code on the models. So picture the slice through the application, the entire vertical that you're trying to implement. And we started here, we had a person model. We knew we wanted to do something with people. We had a person model. We nailed down some business rules on that. These business rules generally are known at this point. And then we built an interface, the controller and the view. So I actually did it the other way around. We started from our understanding of architecture, which is, okay, we need some database model, we need a person, we need some rules on that, and then we build up the controller, which is just a pass-through entity that's a repeating pattern, and then the view might be a little bit custom. I find that much more valuable than coming from the outside in, because with the outside in, you end up spending all this time on this high-level application stuff, and you don't spend very much time at the low level. You blow your time on different stuff, which is less important in my opinion. There's one more point there. If you're not familiar with the framework, or you're trying to sort of feel your way around it, and you're trying to learn, then the outside-in model might seem appealing initially, but I also find that the best learning you can actually get from looking at the data. The data is always where the rubber hits the road, and you get a lot more mileage understanding things like, nested scopes or associations, and learning things from that angle than trying to come too much from the outside, because then naturally the application tends to be heavy on the top and have a lot of code in the view on the controller and not enough in the model. I think the BDD outside-in behavior drives the wrong kind of application development. Okay, view testing. Let's do some. Now that I talked about it, let's do some. So I want to do a very thin view test, as I mentioned, and I want to do it. So these view tests, they came with the generator. So here's my new, and it's not very useful. So I'm going to just kill this. And actually, it doesn't contain the latest stuff either, so this is not necessary. It's redundant. So what I want to verify, there's two key pieces that I want to check. A, the view renders correctly, and B, that the form posts to the correct URL. This is actually a behavioral problem that I want to double check. If my form post went to the wrong URL, the application wouldn't work properly. So that's the one thing that I want to verify. It has a form posting to the people URL. That's all I want to check. And that implicitly checks also that the view renders properly. And I need to do. Thank you. All right. So the render up here, by default, will render the template that is listed in the describe block. So if there's a template under people new, which hopefully there should be because we're following the conventions, then I don't need to do anything else. The render will find it automatically. So by now I have rendered a view. And then I can check the response should have tag. That's the RSpec helper for it. Now this checks for this checks for HTML tags using CSS selectors. I'm going to give you a simple one. The simplest one is form. So you put the tag name there, and this will return success if there's a form tag on the page. Let's start here because we're missing something, but I want to show you what we're missing. Okay, so it failed to render. It failed to render. Template error. Called ID for nil. This is what you were talking about. So what happens if something is nil? What actually is wrong here? Any guess?
You haven't set up the person.
I haven't set up the person, right. So the view tests in RSpec do not run the controller. They're totally standalone. All they do is grab the form file and render it. If there's any variables required to render this form correctly, which is the case here because we have the form for add person here, this person is a nil right now. Then the form rendering fails. So this is where I have to put in a variable. And I use the assigns hash just the same way with variables. That is the same mechanism that we can use to stick in variables into the view test, into the view template. And I can just make a new person here. So let's try that again. That worked. Great. So this is one of the areas, this highlights one of the areas where there is a test coverage gap. Because if I don't put the right variables here, that the controller sets up, then the view test will render or not render. So there is no direct connection between controller and view in RSpec. And this is the one place where I would say there is some room for what the book calls exploratory testing. Namely, you write up a higher level integration test in RSpec integration, Cucumber, Selenium, or your favorite framework du jour. And you walk it through the application in exploratory steps. You explore the app in sort of the main feature set that you have. So he's making an argument that you could also combine these two. Actually, RSpec comes with a feature to do that. You could call in here in the controller test, you could put something, I'm going to show you. Sometimes it makes sense. You could put a directive here called integrate views. This will actually execute the rendering in the view. Standard RSpec controller test looks at the render call and stops it there. It actually intercepts the rendering and does not render the template. If you put that statement there, it'll render the template, and you get rendering failures right here. This is how the old test unit functional testing used to work. In early Rails functional testing, the view and the controller would be tested together, and the rendering always happened. And then you have these controller tests that test both the controller code and the view code. And RSpec separated those two apart. The reason is that the controller test in the old style test unit functional testing got very large, and there was a dozen assertions for each different test case because it had to assert all sorts of view tags along with controller variables, and it got messy. So this is a way to separate the concerns. The danger or the expense of it is you have a gap here, and this is the place where I don't think this gap is critical, because you do have an umbrella testing that perhaps you should do through Selenium or Cucumber or a tool like that. Or it's easy to spot also just clicking through the site manually on the main course of action. Who knows what RJS is? Okay, 5 people. Good. So RJS is a way that the controller can directly respond with JavaScript. It is built on the stock Rails prototype framework, which is what Rails has as default built-in JavaScript framework. And prototype comes with a couple of helpers such as link remote 2 or form remote 4 or a few others like that. Generally, that stuff's hard to test because your RSpec framework does not execute the JavaScript. So the best you can do is you can check that certain JavaScript code comes back or doesn't come back. RSpec has a few RJS helpers, and you can assert regular expressions often done that certain JavaScript is there. I don't find that very useful. I also find that largely superseded by RSpec that tests controllers responding in JSON, and using a jQuery or some other JavaScript library on the client that talks JSON. So if you test all the JSON objects coming back to the client and using jQuery, I'm sorry?
Did you say client?
Yeah, if you test all the JSON responses coming back to the client, coming out of the server, using RSpec, and you use jQuery, which has a very high level and nice AJAX library that doesn't require much customization, your test coverage is already pretty good. And then you could do something on top. You could do like a Selenium on top if you wanted. If you have older style RJS, you can still use it. It's okay if it doesn't get out of hand. But I find sometimes it gets out of hand and then it becomes difficult to test. RSpec scaffold and mocks. So I haven't shown you what RSpec scaffold generator does. Who has run RSpec scaffold generator before? Bunch of people, right? Okay. So it mocks the models. I don't even want to show you. You can do it at home. I don't want to waste your time with this. I really don't. This is the outside-in philosophy, what you were mentioning earlier. I'm not a fan of this because the mocks have gaps in test coverage which are subtle and hidden. The mocks need to be maintained. I had a speech on that last week here in this room. This outside-in development thing is nifty textbook material, but I have yet to see it proven in an actual pragmatic, value-driven development operation and approach. When taken to the extreme, this whole outside-in becomes very unagile because you get tempted to overbuild the application in your nifty little Cucumber tests before you actually do anything. You have all this mocking stuff, and then by the time you're done with this, time has moved on and the application requirements have changed. So it becomes waterfall again, which is full circle. And so be careful with that stuff. Next week, Sarah will show you 2 great examples of Cucumber. where I advocate it and which is awesome, but I think it's vastly overdone. Is there some blog post about it? Yeah, Josh Susser has written some stuff. I'm intending to write about it. You have me on video that will be coming forward. Aslak is a gifted programmer, no doubt about it. Aslak is the guy who came up with Cucumber. He's a gifted guy, very, very cool contributor to the community. I have nothing against him. He's a gifted engineer. The framework he's created is awesome. I think it is just taken up to the wrong extremes. Okay, I want to change gears. We want to go to nested attributes. This is the last bit. And this is good bang for the buck. Okay, what are nested attributes? They are single form, multiple models. Who has solved this problem before? Few people. Using nested attributes or some homegrown stuff? Homegrown? Right, me too. Yeah, it's painful, right? I spent 6 months of my life once implementing a framework which largely is the same as nested attributes, and then I realized it just came out on Rails. I should have read the blog post earlier. So the reason this is important is because we don't want our database schema to limit the stuff, or we don't want our database schema to dictate how the view should look. The view should look whatever the business needs the view to look. However, we don't want the designer to impose any constraints on our database architecture. We don't want the designer to tell us, that their 25 different fields have to live all in the same table. We want to structure the database schema according to the architectural principles of good coding and decoupling and performance and all that stuff we know. So we need to be able to couple multiple tables to the same form and the same form to multiple tables. And multiple tables are already handled really well through associations in Active Record. Now, how do we put that stuff into the view? And up till Rails 2.3, there was no consistent answer for it. As of Rails 2.3, there is a consistent answer, namely the nested attributes. And this is where views and models collaborate. So there is a model piece that's called accepts nested attributes for. Who has used this? 3 people, 4 people. Okay, cool. There's a view field, a view directive called the form for, we saw that already, and its friend, the field for. And the controller is totally unaware of this. The controller is a single line assignment. It just is the same here, person.new params person. The controller has no clue how many models are involved, and it should not need to. And now, how does this look in practice? In practice, you give it accepts nested attributes for on the association. Okay, so here's addresses. This is on the model. Now, using this, I can create an address record through the person model by using addresses attributes as a key, followed by an array with a hash. I'm very particular about the blue here. This needs to be plural. Addresses is a plural when this up here is a plural, when this is a plural. If there was a has one address, you have a has one address, and you have a address singular attributes here. If you have a plural association, you need the square brackets, because you have more than one, perhaps. And then the stuff in red is a record, one address record. So now I want to have a model. So I want to do exactly what I just showed you. In here, I have all that stuff, associations. How about new context, context nested attributes. So it should create an address record from attributes. So I want to make sure that the person.create first name, Joe, last name, Smith. Now add address, sys, plural, attributes, plural, assigned to an array of records which contain the required address fields, namely the city, the street, the state, and the zip. And so all this stuff now should create a person. So we use our familiar lambda pattern. Lambda 1. So first of all, it should, it should change the person count by 1. But it should also change the address count by 1. So I like to wrap this into 2 lambdas and just check 2 things here. Address with 2D. So let's see how that goes.
Address attributes is not a symbol.
Oh, this one needs to be symbol. Thank you. Okay, and one more time. Okay, unknown attribute, addresses, attributes. That is the correct failure. The reason is we don't have anything in the person spec, anything in the person model that actually understands what addresses attributes is supposed to be. So now we need to toss that in here, and this is where the magic accepts, a little bigger, nested attributes 4 comes in. This works only when you have a has many association, of course, or if it has one association. So you need to have something that is associated already. Let's try that again. Sweet, that worked. Okay, so now let's figure out how we can hook that up on our view. We want to be able to enter multiple addresses, or at least one at this point, for the view. So, okay, let's make a controller test. Make sure that the controller can swallow this. So technically, we don't actually have to, because the controller just stays a single line assignment. So here's the controller. Let's see, here's our create method. So here is the person, So now I should be able to stick in, just without further changes, attributes, add. So here, because so is here one perhaps is, and then the person. So the person now add. So now because you stick in one perhaps stick in, and then without changes. So here is the person. So now I should be able to stick in array with array changes array. So here array. Okay, so and so what I can do is I can verify here, in the lambda where it actually checks the creation. I could double check that the address gets wrong keys. The address gets made green. So 0 line changes in the controller. The controller is the same deal, 1 line assignment or creation of the new person record, and now it can accept a complicated nested hash. The last bit missing is the view. Let's do the view. So here we need to have something about addresses on there now. Now this is actually something that I find worthwhile testing. So let's throw in a quick test on that. Now I'm coming to the top of the vertical slice. Yes, exactly. And I started thinking about, okay, I just did it in my mind, and this helps when you have a pair. Okay, well, we want to have an address field on our form. Okay, well, if we do that, then we need something in the model that holds this. So what model code do we have to do? Oh, okay, we have to have something about nesting in the model. Let's take a test in the model that has a nested attribute hash. And then my BDD is already done. So I'm just thinking about it, But I could spend like 3 days mocking up some elaborate thing in Cucumber and figuring out what steps to use. But at the end of the day, BDD doesn't absolve you from having to think about architecture. So you still have to think about architecture, even if you do BDD. And if you start thinking about architecture, then the whole BDD thing is just an exercise in something not very useful. Definitely there's value in thinking about, what the app should look like to the user. I don't think that value is best spent expressing that stuff in Cucumber, because the Cucumber stuff is way too simplistic for modern day apps. It cannot do any JavaScript type stuff, any whiz-bang, slide open, close, rotate, fade in, fade out, none of that stuff. So the use case for Cucumber is a fairly simplistic use case, and that I think is overdone. You need to think about the architecture one way or the other. Now, what BDD encourages you to is to think about small vertical slices, as I'm talking about, and this is the bottom-up slice. So we started about view. Okay, I want multiple forms on my model. This is what my first slide was. But then I dropped down, okay, let's start with a model, and let's build it back up. So here we are, build it back up. So I want to, here's my view test, BDD. I want to have, actually, this never got finished, really, that the form has the right path. So that in a second. I want to check that there should be an input field on there, an input tag, which takes some attributes from the address. So there should be an input tag that has name equal something, and this something should be, well, a street, for example. But I don't know what all the stuff in the middle is here. There's going to be some person, and there's going to be nested, and something else. So I'm going to content myself to say star equals street. This is a CSS selector rule that checks for an input tag having a street attribute, having an attribute that contains the word street somewhere in it. And up here, what I had meant to write, that the URL that this form posts to is /people. So let's try running this test. Has a form, actually has, this is wrong, has an input field for street. Okay, so this test failed. The second one failed, saying there is no such matching element. Not yet, right? So we haven't put it yet. Okay, so here's my view. Now I want to stick that stuff on here. So nested attributes also works with the form 4. I would encourage you to read the documentation page on that. It talks about it. So assuming that I want on here the attributes for the addresses, I do a fields for addresses do adder, and then I need an end. So what does this do? A fields for is like a form for. It gives me a builder block here, so I can stick stuff in here now, but it doesn't actually generate its own form tag. It's the only difference between the form for and the field for. Form for will generate a form tag, the field for does not. And you notice I forgot something here. I need to have an f dot. With the f dot fields for, this fields for now becomes aware that it has a parent which has some other thing on it. And even more so, it becomes aware that this method should be an association on the thing that's up here, on the person. So this will actually loop over it. If you have a bunch of addresses already in your person model, this will generate a loop over as many addresses as you already have there. Which is why this will fail in a second. So now I want to put all my fields now start with the address builder, and I want to put in the street and actually, how did I do this up there? I did it differently. I want to put in the street and the label for it. Text field street. Okay, I'm gonna just test my spec here. You could put symbols if you like. Oh, didn't find one. Okay, what is broken? Well, the good news is it did render the view, so there's no error on it. Well, let's take a look in the browser. Something is wrong. People/new. Any guesses already? I said something earlier, just a second ago. I forgot it myself. But I remember. Yes, thank you. There is an address missing. I said earlier, this thing loops, the fields for will loop over the number of addresses you have in your person, which is 0, right? It's empty. So this is why I put the view test. I want to make sure that at least some of these fields show up.
If they're there.
If they're there, but they're not there. But this is counterintuitive. I want my address to show up. For a new person, I want my address. I want one address record. So is not there. The view test is saving me here. All right, so now I could go in the controller. So I don't know if you realized what's going on, but what is the problem that's missing is when I have, let's see, where's the new person here? So I should have a new person object, and also that person there should have an address record. So I'm here in the controller test for new. So that addresses dot should not be empty.
Signs is just
Thank you. Okay, expected empty to return false got true. So it actually is empty. We need to fix this. And the way to do it here is the person can create an address record, a blank address record through the association.
Addresses attributes.
Close. Addresses. Close. Build. Addresses dot build. That makes an address record on the association. Addresses dot create tries to save it. Dot build is in memory. Dot new doesn't work here. This is an association method. So let's see my test suite now. I'm going to run the entire test suite. Rec spec. And something failed, right. There was some old junk in here. Oh, the mock exercise, right, okay. So much for doing my homework. Okay, let's take that one out. Okay, but the critical part that we worked on just now succeeded. Except this one doesn't want to succeed. Let's just kill this guy. Okay, 4 failures. What are the other failures? Customer loyalty, people index. Well, there's a ton of problems in here, guys. Jeez. This one still didn't work. Name street. Let's see what our form has now. It has address records. And why does the name street not work? Yeah. So down here. Oops, where did it go? So it has name, person attributes, street. So this is wrapping here. So here's the name attribute. Person addresses attributes is kind of complicated, and then 0 street. So that, I'm not sure why that is. This one still doesn't have it because the person is new and has no address record. Same. So this is where the controller and the view have a test gap, right? I mentioned that. Okay, so let's make a person p.addresses.build. Okay, success. All right, so now let's do a quick smoke test on this here. The button is in the wrong place. Let's put the button down a bit. This button. Oops. Okay. All right, so now I can put a person in. One, 2, 3 main. San Francisco is open.
nice autofill.
It's open. We typed in before. Somebody did that already for me. Okay. Okay, successfully saved. So our display doesn't show the address records yet. So let's see where our index view is. Index. Oops, not that one. Index. So here we don't show the address right now, but we could do something like if p.addresses dot, well, first here, I'm going to grab the first address. Okay, let's do it this way. I'm only going to show the first address today. And if adder.present, then we do something else, So this is a part where a little bit of view logic doesn't hurt too bad, and we can put in adder.street city state and zip. And here's my address. I made a new li item. A couple more ideas on nested attributes, and then we wrap up. So a new record, we did create only, right? A new record is recognized by the absence of an ID. Read this carefully. So we have the city, the zip, the street, and the state. If you want to update an existing record through this mechanism, you need to put in the ID. It tells the difference between existing and new, whether or not the ID is present. So an existing record is recognized by this. If this is not here, it thinks it's a new record. There's singular and plural. I mentioned this already with the array brackets and the plural here. Couple of parameters. I didn't show this today, but if the address is blank, so you should be able to put in a record where there is no address, but just a name. That currently doesn't work because of our address validation rules. If you want a name without the associated address, you can put a parameter on there, which is called reject if all blank. So you can put a parameter on the accepts nested attributes for with reject if, which takes a proc or a method call that can reject records subject to some custom conditions, and there's a shortcut, all blank. We can pass just this symbol, and that will prevent the errors from being run if the associated record, the address in this case, has no data on it. That's useful sometimes, and there's a couple others. This stuff has expanded in recent history. You can also destroy records using the nested attributes. So this is what I do, value-driven outside in BDD. So write the controller test first, that's okay. And then you might find yourself in a bind where the controller test actually cannot run because model stuff is missing. Then my recommendation would be put a pending on the controller test, resist the urge to put mocks in there, then work on the model logic, flesh that out, and come back to redo the controller tests. Then you add the views. Views is the last bit of the vertical. And then you can submit that, and then you can put an overall exploratory Cucumber or Selenium test. End of story for today. Thanks, guys, for staying late.
Thank you.